Welcome, everyone. My name is Jérôme Marty, and I am a project director at the CCA. And I will be today making a few introductions about the report and monitor the questions as well and help out during the Q&A period. Before we start the presentation, I would like to acknowledge the land where we are. The CCA is located in Ottawa, and we are located on the unceded, unsurrendered ancestral home of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, which has nurtured the land, water, and air of this territory and continues to do so today. I will ask you to take a moment to think and acknowledge the land where you are on, since there are people here from many locations. On behalf of the CCA, we are pleased to share with you a presentation of our new report, Building a Resilient Canada, Bâtir un Canada Résilient, authored by the expert panel on disaster resilience in a changing climate. As indicated in the announcement for this webinar, 3 panel members will be joining us. Scott Vaughan, the chair of the panel and senior fellow with IISD. Elliot Capel, who used to be with WSP Canada and moved recently to PwC. And finally, Yemena Ezaguirre, who will be joining us from ESSA. To start the presentation, I will just say a few words about the question that was asked to the CCA. The CCA receives questions from many sponsors and departments, mostly federal departments. And the work of the panel and the work of the CCA starts with the questions being submitted. The questions we received here is called the charge, and it is the following one. What key opportunities exist to improve disaster resilience in Canada through better integration of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptations research and practice? Public Safety Canada was the main sponsor submitting these questions to the CCA, but there were many other co-sponsors, and these are Natural Resource Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Infrastructure Canada, Finance Canada, Health Canada, and Transport Canada. To start our work at the CCA, we find experts to help us answer the questions. And for this assessment, we had 11 experts from various disciplines, from the climate adaptation side, from the disaster reduction side, people from academia, from industry, and from NGOs as well. In thinking about the charge for this assessment, you can see that there were 3 sub-questions. The first one was to look at barriers and incentives and disincentives that prevents effective integrations between climate adaptations and disaster risk reduction. The second one was to look at tools and data that will be needed to be considered to facilitate such integration. And the last one was about the capabilities that are required to enhance resilience to climate-related natural disasters in the future. There are many spheres that are involved to contribute to promote disaster resilience. And you can see it in the report, we were asked to focus only on 2 of these spheres, the climate change adaptation and the disaster risk reduction that you can see at the bottom of this figure here. There are many other aspects and dimensions, and the panel recognizes that any improvement made within each of these other spheres is likely going to help promoting the integrations between CANDRR. With this, I will now turn to Scott Vaughan, chair of the panel, to share about the key findings and reflections that are included in the report. Thank you, Scott.
Great, good. Jean, thank you very much. And colleagues, thanks all of you for joining this presentation today. Also, thanks very much to our fellow panelists, Yamena and Elliot, for joining us today. And I very much look forward to the discussion. And also just at the beginning to say thanks to Jerome and Suzanne Looney and all the other really outstanding staff at the CCA Secretariat. This has really been a pleasure. Next slide, please. So the panel began its work, I think in March or April 2020. They met, the full panel met 9 times over the course of 2020 until the completion of the report in late 2021, and then it was released in January 2022. And in addition to those 9 full meetings, lots of other meetings, draft reviews back and forth, and just to say all the panel members are volunteers, and it really just an indication or reflection of their expertise and commitment to this work. So like other CCA reports, this report is based on academic literature reviews. There were a number of expert interviews, including with several First Nation associations, review of gray literature, of synthesis reports, and also looking at Indigenous and local knowledge. And also an important part of the CCA process is external peer reviews. And you can see the list of those DRR, the disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation experts, also in the report. So just at the beginning, for those that I know you were experts who were attending this, I mean, the report the panel spent a lot of time thinking and being fairly exact about the nature, the terminology around risk, rather than saying this is sort of a stationary point, looking at a dynamic interaction or nexus among hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. The report doesn't use the term natural disasters. And sort of a key finding of the report, I mean, clearly from evidence from IPCC, as well as events in Canada and around the world, we know the incidence of natural hazards linked to extreme weather events and climate events are increasing. There's nothing that we can do reasonably in order to change that trajectory in the near term, but there's plenty that we can do in order to reduce the exposure and the vulnerability to those increasing natural hazards. Next slide, please. I think, as we all just mentioned, the IPCC, you as practitioners will know that we're seeing an increase in the frequency and severity of hazards in Canada. The incidents of 2021 sort of speak volumes to that. A number of extreme temperature records have been broken, wildfires, as well as then the flooding in British Columbia and elsewhere in 2021. And that we know is happening around the world. We also know that the level of insured losses linked to natural hazards are also increasing. I think in 2020, the insurable losses in Canada were $2.4 billion. An important focus of the panel is saying that the uninsured losses are higher. We don't know exactly what they are, but one of the, I thought really interesting areas of focus of the panel report was among those sort of losses are things that are related to what are the human costs, the long-term human costs related to longer stress-related impacts of extreme weather events, for example, on communities that have been dislocated, communities that are lost, or faced death and destruction, and then stress around relocation. So those are all parts of costs which typically don't get into ledger books of insured losses. As IPCC has long said, and others, the nature of extreme weather events related to climate, I mentioned, are dynamic, meaning concurrent, cascading, and nonlinear. Meaning on nonlinearity is that seemingly small incremental changes, for example, in Canada's average temperature increases, which are now at 1.1 degrees Celsius above the baselines, that those seemingly incremental changes can lead to big and unforeseen impacts. The only other thing I'd mention in the context of climate, is I know many of us obviously watched Glasgow and COP15. You're at least seeing now at the international, as well certainly as in Canada, that climate adaptation, which has generally been sort of a second tier to climate mitigation, move to decarbonization, that in Glasgow, there was a lot of progress on increasing the urgency of building climate adaptation as well as funding climate adaptation. Next slide, please. So the first finding of the report, just going back to the charge that Jerome had mentioned, the panel was asked to look at opportunities to integrate two different communities which have complementary charges, community of programs and disciplines looking at disaster risk reduction, and community of practices and programs looking at climate adaptation. And we said that there is an ongoing failure to fully integrate those two communities, and the consequence of this failure to fully integrate is a loss of efficiency, as well as impact on public investments, leaving then communities to risk. And so we'll go into that a little more detail. So just to say as well, just at the very beginning, what we looked at in this integration was, there's many ways you could look at it. We looked at three, just sort of you think about this. The first one is the role of data and knowledge. The second is the role of financing, and the third is the role of governance. So just on this first one in information, one of the things we mentioned is that in Canada, and going back to this question of concurrent, cascading, and nonlinear, we know interconnection between different natural disasters. Think about the heat waves in British Columbia, wildfires, consequence of wildfires in many areas would undermine the durability of top and other soils in that. The flooding in November and December actually then some of the literature is suggesting it magnified the consequences of that flooding, leading to unprecedented destruction in infrastructure, which then led to disruption of Canada's supply chains, which has now led to economy-wide impacts. So within that, given these concurrent of these events, we noted that Canada lacks an integrated all-hazard risk assessment platform or tool in order to look at how these different events can happen. And just to say that this compares to other OECD countries where all hazard risk assessments are made available. In Canada, at the federal level, they're secret because it's dealing obviously with other public risks. But what we did note also with Canada's all hazard risk assessment is that the methodology used by the federal government of Canada in looking at all hazards is basically on recent historical events. And again, we know that the past is no longer an entirely reliable roadmap for what will happen in the future, particularly given the rate of global warming. Next slide, please. Just for those of you who practice, just to state the obvious, that there's many different risk factors. We did look at seismic events, for example, but also just to say, going back to this question that that natural hazards are increasing, but there's a lot that can be done to reduce the vulnerability exposure of populations. The only other thing just mentioned on this slide is that in Canada, and indeed in many other countries, there's a bias towards responding, towards preparing and responding to extreme weather events, and sort of by comparison, certain significant underinvestment. The slide says mitigation, it's risk mitigation. You can see that in many of the programs that we examined. Next slide, please. So the second finding from the report is to look at how do you overcome these two sort of separate disciplines or departmental silos, and we just mentioned a few of them. So the first one is just to sort of just probe a little bit of this, is that, why are they different? And typically, I mean, these are generalizations because the details matter, but generally disaster risk response DRR programs and practitioners, for good reason, tend to be structured on a command and control, centralized decision-making, very short-term or comparatively short-term, in order to prepare for an emergency event. And by contrast, climate adaptation tends to be based on a more sort of bottom-up or horizontal structure, looking at long-term, tends to be more participatory, and also tends to focus more on upstream prevention. And just thinking about this integration, I mean, one of the areas that we looked at, particularly from the charge from Public Safety Canada, is how can some of the characteristics of climate adaptation, particularly in prevention, be embedded into DRR practices. The other thing, just very briefly mention, is just generally in Canada and elsewhere, why isn't there more investment in upstream prevention? And generally, there's I thought, interesting analysis based on literature review on this question of myopia, inertia, and optimism. Basically, that it may be happening in another community. I can watch it or follow it in the news, but it probably isn't going to happen in my neighborhood because it never has happened in the past. The only other thing just to mention it on this information is just this, and I'll go into this a little more, is just this importance of accuracy of information around perceptions of risk and potential hazard mitigation options. And those are, important in how people think about risk at the community level, at the household level, as well as with businesses and elsewhere. I think one of the observations from the panel's report is the lack of updated and accessible flood risk maps in Canada. It's now been highlighted as in mandate letters of the federal government to update those flood risk maps. Among the observations in the report is that only 6% of Canadians that are living in areas of high flood risk actually are fully aware of the risks that they face, either at the household level or at the community level. Next slide, please. The other thing, I'm based in Ottawa, and so just about a kilometer from me, we have a bunch of truckers who are demonstrating. And I think that this is sort of a challenge in all, basically, in virtually every country in the world, which is you can have the best data, you can have the best information. That information can be accessible to different communities, but it also has to be trusted. And this question of trusted sources of information is something which is, really sort of a challenge to sort of just certainly my sort of perception of how good governance functions. And so I think one of the areas that we identified would just are, what are different models of information which meets that criteria around being up to date, being accessible, being timely, and be trusted. There's different examples in Canada, for example, on Statistics Canada. In Canada, we use something called a UB index, which people listen to every day. And those are types of models that we can look at to learn from. Next slide, please. The second one is just financial barriers, and I'll speed up because I want to leave time for discussion. The second one is financial barriers, and there's a lot of analysis within the report on looking at different models of insurance, both private insurance, public insurance, as well as public sector partnerships in order to provide greater coverage. And we know that that uninsured losses, as I mentioned at the beginning, can often be far higher than insured losses, and there's questions around moral hazard. The other insurance or financial area that we looked at was that there are different federal, we look primarily at federal recovery programs. And generally, there is an opportunity in those programs, particularly on after a post-emergency on rebuilding, to look at different ways to embed more resilient infrastructure within those built assets that have been damaged, or to relocate those assets to areas outside of high-risk areas. And again, the bias among many of these programs, understandably, is to get the money out the door as quickly as possible to rebuild in the same way in the same place. And there's an opportunity now, to embed that. And you can see some of the programs within Canada in integrating different resilience within programs. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, there are sort of 6 areas of information that we looked at in the report. One is the Canadian Disaster Database. Thinking about those criteria I mentioned before, that it's timely, it's accessible, the data is robust, and it's trusted. The report notes that this database is severely limited in meeting that criteria. And so there's an opportunity, I think, to do a better job in having that database. And there's different protocols at the federal government on ensuring quality assurance within how databases are built and used at the federal level. Other second area I just mentioned very quickly is nature-based solutions. And I imagine many of you are looking at these. And there's many different examples that the report notes on the use of nature-based solutions. In Canada, for example, on the border of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, on the west coast of Canada, and then internationally in the Netherlands and the UK and elsewhere. I mean, the one thing I just mentioned from this is an area which is growing very quickly, but the underlying metrics on how to measure the performance outcomes of nature-based solutions still is very much in flux. And so if you are a city planner or an engineer or an architect, and you have to comply with professional standards around on the expected performance of projects and built infrastructure, this is an area and having some kind of standardization around the performance impacts of nature-based solutions, I think, is really important. The third one is just on economic analysis. Again, this is sort of there's lots of different data on for every dollar spent on flood-proofing your home, you can save $11 on post-disaster cleanup. But this sort of economic analysis are still sort of one-offs and haven't been integrated more broadly into either into the private sector or public sector. Last one, I mentioned all hazards. For me, the most important, really among the most interesting areas of this work, of this report, has been the work on Indigenous and local knowledge. Just to mention at the sort of the view of the panel in speaking with climate experts, as well as literature reviews and others, is that this form of knowledge represents a distinct sort of methodology on how to think about disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation, distinct from sort of Western models, and distinct meaning on par with, equal, and in many cases, the practices of Indigenous and local knowledge of First Nations and Indigenous knowledge can improve the resilience of practices. One example the report notes is cultural burnings related to forest management. There's some evidence from British Columbia and elsewhere that those practices actually led to a reduction in the risk in wildfires in 2021. So for me, and I hope we have a discussion about this, for me, one of the take homes from this report is, I mean, this could be and should be a sort of a standalone area of future work with Indigenous experts as panel members to further explore this. And then the last one, and Elliot is on this call, is just the importance of knowledge brokers. And the more that looking at this report, the more I sort of recognize how critically important this is. We're all now faced with a huge amount of data, a huge amount of information. Scientists are always not as good as communicating the work that they're doing on climate modeling to be accessible and understandable to different people at local town councils, local business and small entrepreneurs, city planners at the city or county level. And so there are different examples of that. The one I think we mentioned in the report was using tools like large-scale spatial planning and maps, which include narratives. The Climate Atlas of Canada, for example, is one model of that, where you could actually have a way of bridging sort of raw data. What does it mean to you in the at the local level? Next slide, please. So the second one, and I'll be brief on this, and this is this question of financing and insurance, and I, you know, there are different examples of this. I think you're seeing now steps by the insurance company, for example, to mandate having home insurance for new builds, which have basement backflow tools to decrease the risk of flooding, for example. But Canada, again, comparing with OECD countries, I mean, Canada could do better. There's only one insurer that offers flood insurance around river floods, and there's another single insurer that provides insurance for saltwater flooding related to coastal flooding. And so I think we pointed out, to compare to other countries, there's gaps still in the accessibility and affordability of private insurance, including home insurance. We also just mentioned that in order to help cover these gaps, I mean, one of the examples we turned to was public-private sector partnerships. An example, for example, in the United States, where there's a program which is now backstopped or guaranteed by the US federal government to provide broader home flood insurance. The only other thing I'll mention from this, and again, this is something I learned during the course of the panel, for those of you who are working with the financial sector, Canada in 2021, together with the other G7 countries and other countries, have now adopted mandatory risk disclosure for climate risk for the financial sector. And most of that from the TCFD report has been around sort of risk related to high carbon assets and stranded assets. But in that TCFD recommendations, there's also a disclosure of physical risk related to climate events. And so, you know, just thinking about this moving forward, there's going to be yet another really important stream of information and data around climate risk. Next slide, please. So the last slide is this question of governance. And I mean, I think what the report says, and we all know very well who are following or working on DRR and climate adaptation, is that there's no single entity or agency that in itself can be able to address the risks that we see and will be increasing. And so the report notes the role or the taking this from a whole of society collaboration, which sounds great, but it's hard to do. And I think that breaking down what does whole of society collaboration actually mean is really will be critically important. So, at the federal level, ensuring close coordination among different federal agencies, ensuring coordination between federal and provincial, between federal and county, building up cooperation with the academic community, with the private sector, et cetera. So a couple of the areas that we then looked at among all the different actors from this is just the role of the federal government on providing the two previous things that I just mentioned. So the first one is doing a better job at updating information and data in order to inform Canadians about changing nature of climate-related risks and natural hazards. And then the second one is just their role in funding, to provide federal funding transfers to the right place at the right time to build in prevention in moving forward. So those two things are really important. What we also then said was, but the best decisions on climate resilience happen at the local level. And there were different examples which are made throughout the report. In fact, the report does a really, really amazing job on providing examples within Canada, as well as around the world, on different models, on everything that I've just talked about. One that we had mentioned on looking at sort of local decision-making is something that the province of Nova Scotia did. There was a federal transfer that went to the province. The province then said to every town and county in Nova Scotia, if you want to have access to that money, you have to develop at your town and county level a climate adaptation plan. And those plans differ because towns across any province differ. And so there was a 75% uptake in that program, where now 75% of towns across the province now have climate adaptation. And then the last thing I'll just mention is among that whole of society is the role of different codes, regulations, and standards. We looked at different examples of codes, regulations, and standards from the ISO, from Engineers Canada, from other groups, and those are also things which are extremely important on building codes for flooding, for fire-resistant roofs, and others. Next slide, please. And this is just a brief conceptual framework that looked at just these two areas, and then there was this sort of very fantastic and exciting ways that they come together to build increased resilience. I mean, the thing I'll just mention and just underscore, and then I'm going to end, is that the report has been very much focused on this question of how to operationalize this integration. So we took so it's just this question about what does it mean in concrete programs on moving up from an operational level. And last slide, I think. And then the last is just a reflections from the panel. And of these, I'll just mention that one of the areas that and Jimena, I'm really glad that you're here, is one of the things that we had mentioned is that the report that we were fully sort of thought a lot about and talked a lot about the root causes, structural causes around different vulnerabilities across Canada, and many of those relate to structural issues of inequality, of discrimination, and others, and so important to look at those inequalities in thinking about building resilience, particularly in the context of Canada's commitment to reconciliation, but also just one example for the United States, the Biden administration in 2021 directed FEMA to look at how they can address racism, and how FEMA has responded in the past to emergency events, and how they can embed greater equality in the programs moving forward. So sorry for going on so long, and very happy to take questions. And I think Elliot and Jimena will be here, as well as with Jerome and Suzanne and others, in answering any questions you have or points. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Scott. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite now Elliot and Yemena to join in for the question period. And the last slide that you see, I think, is just the place where you can download the report if you would like to read it in French or in English. And with this, maybe I'll stop sharing my screen so we only have us. And that should have done it, hopefully. And maybe a first questions before we go to the questions from the audience. And we'll start with Yemena and Elliot. You've been part of this journey for close to 2 years, looking at this question charge that was challenging. And for you, what are the key messages, the key points that you take from this report, given your expertise in climate adaptations? What are the key findings and key messages that you will that you gained from being on this panel? Yemena, you want to start?
You want to go first?
Sure, I can go. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm Jimena Izaguirre, a Senior Climate Change Adaptation Specialist at ESSA Technologies. So I just wanted to bring up two things. One thing, in some feedback that we heard about the report, there's an acknowledgement that, in different places of the country, we're recognizing that a common foundation between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation is like good information, good governance, finance or funding or financial incentives. So there is recognition that those are kind of the important foundational elements. And I think what this report does is elevate that common foundation of understanding or common understanding to the national level. And so if we're kind of all aligned on or at least through this report, a common finding that is kind of cross-cutting and nationally applicable is there, then I think we're more likely to move forward on figuring out specific solutions that can be applied nationally and those that require significant regional, local tailoring to move forward. So that's one thing. The second thing is that, I'm an adaptation practitioner. So I worked on adaptation, trying to help communities, governments, organizations integrate climate change thinking into their decision-making for a number of years now and trying to build capacity for that to happen. And a lot of the messaging that we've been used to saying is, if you provide folks the right information and tools, get it into their hands, then they'll assess the risks and they'll notice like how beneficial it is to act before an extreme event or a climate change impact happens. And I think I hope this report makes evidence that yes, a good foundation of decision relevant information is important, but not sufficient to guarantee action. So there's lots of other things related to, the way we make decisions, the number of actors implicated in those decisions, the scale of the problem, not matched to power and kind of capacity to address it. So those are the two things I wanted to highlight. Over to you, Elliot.
Thanks. It's interesting that you say that because, and I reflect on the process of being part of the panel. I recall that our first meeting was virtual, and it was in April 2020, and we were talking about how we were going to get together in 6 weeks when this would all be so far behind us. And I think that so much of what's happening in the space in which I'm a practitioner in ESG, climate change sustainability, is about an evolving and changing perception of risk, and the reality that risks do come true at some time. But then there's the related issue of trust, which was brought up by one of our fellow panel members early on, and I'm not sure I really got it until we went through the whole process. And really, you see how important trust is. As Jimena said, just because we get the information to somebody doesn't mean they're going to act on it. And you see it throughout this whole report, but we also see it in our daily lives. I think a lot of people are tuning in from Ottawa today, and I think you see another manifestation of that similar issue in society today, or concept or problem about trust in society, trust in institutions, and so on. And I think that is a thread that both adaptation and DRR need to deal with together. And to me was something that I hadn't really considered all before we joined. Just the last thing I want to mention, and it's one that it's been a reflection since the panel, And Scott touched on it very briefly when he talked about how, climate, I won't use Scott's words because I don't remember them exactly, I use my own. Us climate change adaptation people are sitting in academic lounges at McGill University and, jackets with patches and so on. And the DRR folks are command and control, on the ground operational. And one of the ways that I've seen the difference in that practice is that really a lot of the DRR practice is based on backwards looking data. And so when you extrapolate from backwards looking data, you see certain risks going in the future, whereas adaptation people are looking with forward looking data in different climate scenarios, just as an example. And I think that mentality, that difference between the two professions or practices is something that's complicated to overcome, and it's a big part of this integration. So for me, the three things were risk, our perceptions of risk, trust, and the different mindsets between the two practice areas that could come together.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you, Yemena. And I'm now going to use some of the questions that came from the audience. And the first one is on natural-based solutions. The question is the following. When you consider natural-based solutions, how do you reflect both their greater vulnerability to and greater resilience from climate impacts? And maybe I'll ask Yemena to start on this reply. Thank you, Yemena.
Thanks, Jerome, and thanks for the question. I think we did highlight nature-based solutions throughout the report, but an overriding message that hopefully comes out clearly in the report too is that we need more research and more information on how nature-based solutions can perform or could perform in the future to account for example, the impacts of climate change and probably other human-caused stressors on the ecological functions. So while there's a number of examples, and Scott brought this up too, of for example, like municipal natural assets initiative projects and other smaller kind of local initiatives going on all of our coasts, we still need more information on their performance in the long term. So that's hopefully an overriding message that comes out clearly in the report and is something that we really need to turn to as well. There's a lot internationally and within Canada, a lot of momentum around nature-based solutions. They're called different things: ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem-based DRR, natural climate solutions with biodiversity co-benefits, et cetera, lots of momentum. But I think we still have a lot of work to do to understand good standards for nature-based solutions to guarantee the outcomes that we're looking for, and in particular, kind of under what conditions might they not perform as we would like them to.
Thank you, Yemena. Any additional comments, Elliot or Scott?
Yeah, I mean, just very, very briefly for those who are interested. There's a really good report on the Global Environment Facility webpage under their scientific substa body, and it was an outside review co-authored by Mark Stafford Smith from Australia, who looked exactly at what Yemena said, is how do you evaluate the outcomes of nature-based solutions within the context of climate resilience? There's lots of different databases from Oxford, from the EU, Horizon 2020. There's thousands of different nature-based solutions. But this sort of looking at a convergence towards a metric, which people would have confidence in to be able to say, if we put this tidal system in, it's going to have a greater resilience or a stronger performance than rebuilding a gray concrete wall. So that's where I think we are right now with nature-based solutions, and I'm confident we'll get there. So the people will say the metrics actually add up.
Exactly what I was going to say. So
perfect. I'm then going to the next question, and maybe this one is for you, Scott, to start. In your opinion, would you consider emissions reduction measures to be an effective options for hazard mitigations, improving resilience?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just very briefly, the charge of this panel was looking at climate adaptation. And obviously, climate mitigation and climate adaptation are strongly linked. But we kept the charge of this panel was not on looking at greenhouse gas emission reductions. I would say for those interested, if you know, the best way of lowering risk is lowering the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. There's work on short-lived climate pollutants, on methane, on HFCs, and those are things that actually can provide shorter-term benefits on de-risking. But the charge of this panel was on DRR and adaptation.
Thank you, Scott. And you can find the rationale on this in chapter 1 of the report, where we do really say this is the box within that the panel worked on. The next question.
Sorry,
yes,
Jerome. I just wanted to add one small thing that I think does come through in the report as well, is that just a reminder that even if we were to cut emissions to zero tomorrow, there's still a degree of climate change that's going to happen for decades, centuries to come. So it won't totally eliminate the hazard or changes in the frequency or intensity of hazards. Thanks.
Thank you, Yamina. The next question is about investments in DR and adaptation. And one of the questions that was raised in the chat was the notion of underinvestment in adaptation. Did the panel find Canada was under investing in adaptation specifically? And maybe we can have Elliot or Yamina start on this.
I will admit that I can't remember whether the panel arrived at that, so I don't want to speak now as out of place. I don't think we arrived at that, but I think it is a fair one. Could certainly make that argument. For me, as someone who started my career working internationally and then coming back to Canada, I was surprised that, and I'm still surprised that it feels like 95 or 98% of our conversation about climate change is about transition. And I'm certainly not to diminish the importance of transition, but that balance is, it seems imbalanced. And I think things like the upcoming national adaptation strategy are a very important marker to try and I don't want to say shift the balances and to take away from transition, but to raise the profile, to build the importance of resilience. But even the things that we talked about earlier today, like nature-based solutions, we need a better system for accounting for those. For in the insurance sector or financial services, or even in the real economy, we need stronger leadership on disclosing climate risks. We need to make that case, both in terms of the benefits and the risks for adaptation, much stronger in this country. I think there's from my, I don't want to speak on behalf of the panel for this because I'm a bit outspoken on it, but it is almost unquestionable. And just the last point I would make, something like the national adaptation strategies is a good data point because it's so important in moving us forward. But when we look at other countries like the United Kingdom, who are on their third CCRA, climate change risk assessment, they've had that time for things to percolate and to be embedded into government through law and regulation, and have become much more complex and sophisticated over time. And there's an opportunity we have to take a big step in catching up with that, but we have to be realistic in saying, because we have invested in the past, we're not going to immediately leapfrog all of those. We're not suddenly going to become the world leader. We have a long way to go. And so I think from my perspective, the investments that we're making today, we need to continue to scale them up logarithmically.
Thank you, Elliot. The next question is about terminology. Given the breadth of conceptual and terminological differences, do you have recommendations on how to get practitioners to better understand universal topics around climate policy, leadership, asset management, etc.? And maybe I will direct the questions again to Yamina and Elliot to start. If you have suggestions.
I can start quickly, but I think the person who asked the question brings up a number of good ideas. There are a number of like training courses here in Canada being developed, like some of them delivered by the Climate Risk Institute, who's hosting this this webinar, micro-credential programs, etc. So yeah, these like training programs that are being developed to suit the needs of practitioners who are really looking for tools and methods and things like that. Those are like doing a quick internet search, you can get a long list of things that are happening and current. I would say that throughout the panel process, just being in the same kind of virtual room with practitioners from disaster risk reduction, the disaster risk reduction space was certainly instructive to me, and a deeply kind of immersive experience in understanding how they use the concept of vulnerability, or the difference between emergency management and disaster risk reduction, just things like that, that to us like maybe sound interchangeable, that have very different meanings for them.
Yeah. And if I could just add, in addition to the formal training courses, there are two assets that we have right now from the climate adaptation side and from the climate change side more broadly. The first is that the amount of research and information being generated and produced and disseminated right now is off the charts, even for someone who consumes a lot of it and does it for a living. It's drinking from the fire hose every single day when you wake up in the morning. So even if one doesn't want to take the formal training route, just by signing up for a few newsletters, Bloomberg's green newsletter, the Financial Times Moral Money, I think Globe and Mail has one as well. I'm not advocating for anyone in particular, but just by taking in that information on a daily basis, one can upskill oneself, I think, quite significantly over the course of a few months. The other fantastic benefit we have is that there's so much going on in this space. Literally everybody is hiring. There are tons of, I'm sure, Jerome, from your position on the CCA, you could attest to how much more natural environment, biodiversity, circular economy, climate change is becoming part of the discourse in all of our industry conversations that it wasn't a few years ago. And so there are more opportunities now than ever to not just to train, but to apply that to work in multidisciplinary settings, as Jimena mentioned.
Thank you, Elliot. Jimena. Scott, did you want to add, or do I move to the next question? Perfect. And to add to your comments, Elliot, also within academia, I think we see a rise in new disciplines and new programs throughout the country for those who wants to learn more about DRNCA. I'm going to jump back on the natural-based solutions and to link them with ILK and Indigenous knowledge. The question is the following: going back to the evaluations indicator gap, are Indigenous partners being involved on how to define new metrics for natural-based solutions? And maybe, well, I know, Jimena, you have a lot of experience working with communities, if you want to start answering this question. Thank you.
Well, this is not something we looked at specifically as part of the panel process, but the one thing that I know that is currently happening or in place and needs to be validated further is globally, there's the IUCN global standard on nature-based solutions. And within that standard, there are a number of safeguards related to free, prior, informed consent and kind of equity and participation and those dimensions that, the standards are still kind of at a high level and really need to be localized and tested on the ground. But I think if you look at that standard, there are ways to bring in Indigenous and local knowledge within the kind of design and implementation of nature-based solutions. Here in Canada, a number of the jurisdictions across Canada, provinces, territories are undertaking climate change risk assessments, and probably some of them integrate or specifically look at extreme events and other types of event-based hazards. And I know at least in BC, and maybe there are some participants from BC calling in that, their initial strategic climate change risk assessment specifically did not incorporate or did not look at Indigenous people's issues from the beginning, but there is a whole other separate process dedicated to that, understanding and recognizing that even the conceptualization of risk might be different coming from Indigenous knowledge systems. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Jimena. We're going to take one last question. We have 5 minutes left to this webinar. And this one is about public-private partnerships. And the question is, was the panel recommending we explore public-private partnerships? There's been a lot about how PPP models give current government lots of great talking points, but they actually may not deliver as much on the quality. Can you speak more to this? And I would just add here that The CCA reports do not include recommendations, but we highlight what we think has worked and has not worked. But experts here can definitely say, recommend things based on your own expertise. Maybe Scott and Elliot, you want to tackle this question? Thank you.
Elliot, why don't you go first, Elliot?
Well, I don't know the answer, but I think that, you know, when I hear it, the first thing that pops into my mind is that PPPs are public-private partnerships are all about risk. It's all about the transfer of risk between two parties. And so when we think about disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, of course, there's going to be some crossover with thinking about different models of sharing risk, particularly when it comes to, you know, infrastructure and real assets, capital projects, things like that. I think I don't really have to read between the lines of the question to see that the individual asking it is suggesting that they do not produce better quality. I think the jury's still out on that. I would say that probably risk sharing partnerships between the public and private sector probably do deliver better quality, or at least have the promise to deliver better quality. But you know, I don't know the answers, and I think ultimately it all comes back to a question of how you share risk, particularly through procurement of large projects.
Yeah, great answer, Elliot. I mean, the only thing I'd add to that is that we did make recommendations, as Jerome said. I mean, I think our particular focus on PPPs was how do you think about closing some of the gaps that we noted, for example, in the willingness of the private sector to provide insurance coverage in some areas where if they're not covered, then we have you know, public liabilities or public moral hazard payout. So it really wasn't saying go to PPPs first off, but is there a backstop, as Elliot, you just said, to help de-risk?
Thank you, Scott, Elliot, Yemena. We are now close to the end for this webinar. I want to thank you, panelists, for joining today, and also to thank the audience, the Climate Risk Institute, for allowing this webinar to happen. And again, all informations are the report and other additional information about it can be found on the CCA website. And we wish you a safe and a good day for the rest of your day. Thank you very much.